sleep and I have never been best friends. There are nights when it simply does not come, as if sensing something and wanting me not to sleep but to become a witness. That night, the house was filled with absolute silence, the kind that comes after long and joyful family gatherings where they laugh more than they talk. I came to visit my aunt in Cherkasy. My mother insisted, saying that I needed to unwind, to change the scenery. And there he was, Uncle Sasha, the very one who used to carry me in his arms when I was little, who gave me books by authors I did not understand back then, who looked at me with tenderness, but also with something else that over time I began to notice and did not know how to name. That night, when everyone went to bed, my cousins, my aunt, even my mother in the next room, I stayed in the kitchen, slowly cleaning up the table. And then he appeared. "Still not asleep?" Uncle Sasha asked with a half smile, barefoot, in a simple t-shirt. His tone was soft, intimate. "I don't feel like it," I replied, "and I felt like having some water and checking if you needed company." I shrugged, said I didn't, but he was already sitting across from me with a mug in his hand. Several long seconds of silence, the kind that becomes awkward if you don't look at each other. I pretended to be focused on the cup of herbal tea I had poured for myself, but I could feel his gaze. Not studying, not fatherly, some other kind that he no longer tried to hide. "You've changed a lot," he suddenly said. I looked up. "What do you mean?" "You, yourself, your movements, thoughts. You are no longer the same as before?" "Probably no one stays the same," I answered. "Of course, but you've grown up differently. Faster." That phrase pierced me. I did not understand whether it was a compliment, a warning, or something he did not dare to say aloud. I took a sip of tea and felt warmth in my chest. "And is that good or bad?" He smiled. "Depends on whom you ask." I didn't answer, but looked at him this time without looking away. The conversation drifted further, about books, about music, about travels we would like to make. The talk was easy, yet beneath it lay a barely perceptible tension, like two strings tuned too close together. Every word, every pause, every crossing of glances sounded special. "You know, sometimes it seems to me that you are more like me than your mother," he suddenly said. "We have always gotten along better," I replied without thinking. He lowered his gaze, then raised it again, looking straight into my eyes. "Maybe because with you I don't have to pretend." That phrase left me speechless. I didn't know what to say, or whether I should say anything at all. And then I realized this night was no longer ordinary, and we were no longer just uncle and niece. After that night, something inside me broke. Nothing improper happened. There were no inappropriate gestures or indecent words. And yet, the next morning, when we were having breakfast all together in the shade of the veranda, his presence pierced me so that I could no longer control it. He sat across from me among the clinking of spoons and the smell of coffee. Our eyes met more than once. Short, almost imperceptible, but enough for me to understand that the previous night had left a crack open. My mother spoke enthusiastically about trifles. Aunt was laughing. The children were playing on their phones. Everything seemed ordinary, but the world had changed, at least for me. Now I was aware of his every movement, the way he held his cup, how he spoke with others but seemed to listen to my silences. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked quietly, barely audible behind the clatter of dishes. "A little," I replied without raising my eyes. "Me neither." And that was all. Nothing more followed, but that short exchange of words stayed with me all day, like a frozen note no one dares to release. In the afternoon, Aunt and Uncle went shopping, and Mother dozed off in front of the television. The heat was thick, almost unbearable. I hid in the garden under the gazebo with a book I could not read. The words blurred into a meaningless stream. The air was too saturated with what I did not want to admit. He appeared a little later, silently. "I thought you were in your room," he said, sitting down beside me. "I didn't want to stay within 4 walls." "Me neither." We sat in silence, staring into the distance. The sun was slowly descending, painting everything around in a golden hue. It was an ordinary summer evening, but something in the air made it special. "Does it bother you that I'm here?" he asked. "No," I answered honestly, and that alone was already a confession. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I no longer remember. Time flowed differently when we were like that, without words, almost without movement, when no one knew what hovered between us. Suddenly, I felt him turn toward me. "Do you understand what we're doing?" I looked at him. "We're talking." "No, we're playing with something we're not sure we should touch." His words mirrored my own thoughts. It was not a confession. It was a warning. But in his tone there was tenderness and desire. Not hurried desire, but the kind that ripens in pauses, in the forbidden, that becomes a nameless need. I did not answer, only lowered my eyes, and when I raised them again, his face was closer. Not so close that it could be called audacious, but enough to take my breath away. "We need to go back," I whispered barely audibly. "Do you want to go back?" I wanted to lie, to say yes, that all this was meaningless, that it was just heat, suffocation, nostalgia. But I did not. I stood up silently, and he followed me. That evening dinner was short. Everyone seemed tired. Mother went to bed early, the children too. Silence settled again in the house, like an old friend, and I once more found myself by the sink in the kitchen with a cup of tea in my hands. And again, he came down. He said nothing, just leaned against the doorframe. We looked at each other as if the entire day had been a silent conversation that had now reached its climax. "It can't go on like this anymore," I finally said. "When did it begin?" That question caught me off guard, because I did not know how to answer, as the niece he was supposed to care for, or as the woman I had become. "I don't know," I muttered. "But I do," he said, taking one step forward, just one. "And you too." He did not touch me. We did not cross any physical boundaries. But that night, an emotional betrayal took place, even though no one spoke it aloud. Because in that interweaving of gazes, in that frozen tension that finds no release, we both knew. What existed between us was no longer a hint, but a fact. I went to bed but did not rest. He stayed in the kitchen alone, or maybe not entirely alone, because I felt him in my breathing, in my chest, in that corner of the soul where we keep what must not come to light. The following days resembled a silent dance between us. We did not speak more than necessary, did not openly seek encounters, but understanding floated everywhere. In the accidentally intersecting steps in the corridor, in barely noticeable touches when passing dishes at the table, in those seconds when our eyes met at the other end of a conversation pretending to be ordinary. I was caught between two worlds, the adult who understood the complete inappropriateness of what was happening, and the woman who, unable to resist, eagerly awaited the evening to feel him near again. Evenings were the hardest, slow, warm, when the house sank into a half-sleep from the heat, and everyone was scattered. Mother watched her TV series, aunt and uncle were busy with their own affairs, cousins were buried in their phones, and I searched for him with my eyes in every corner, not daring to admit it even to myself. And he knew with a soft, mature certainty, and behaved as if there was no need to rush, as if what was meant to happen was already happening, though no one could see it. One evening I found myself in the house library. I had always loved that corner, tall shelves, dark wood, an old window draped with heavy curtains. I thought I was alone, or at least it seemed so, until I heard someone enter. It was him. "I thought you were asleep," Uncle Sasha said quietly, "and I thought you were outside." He walked to the window and began to look at the garden. He said nothing more. For a while, we were silent. The silence between us had become so familiar that it no longer weighed us down. On the contrary, it had become our own language. "Have you ever felt out of place in your own life?" he suddenly asked. In his voice sounded that mix of nostalgia and confession you use when you can no longer keep something inside. "Sometimes," I replied. "And what do you do with it?" I looked at him. It was then that I understood something. He was not speaking only about me. He was speaking about himself, about his own alienation, about that restrained sadness he had learned to hide behind politeness. "I keep it until one day it bursts out," I said. He nodded. That's what I thought. We did not touch each other. There was no kiss. But that moment was more intimate than any physical contact, because it was revelation, because we both recognized ourselves in the other's wound, in the shared desire to be seen, accepted, understood. And so, when I returned to my room that night, I began to tremble involuntarily, not from fear, but because I already knew the point of no return was behind us. The culmination came unexpectedly. On a moonless night, everyone was asleep. I went downstairs for water, though I knew I did not want to drink. Deep down, I hoped to meet him there, as I had many times before. But this time it was different. He was already in the kitchen, sitting and waiting. He looked at me silently. I entered, gently closed the door, and the silence that filled the space between us was no longer a bridge or a pause. It was a decision. We stood facing each other. No one asked anything. No one justified themselves. And in that voiceless night, the desire we had restrained for days ceased to be a whisper. It was not a scandal. There was no haste. Everything was slow, careful, inevitable. I will not describe it, because there is no need. It is enough to say that it was not a mistake. It was a choice. The kind you do not shout about, but that leaves a mark forever. When I returned to my room at dawn, I lay down still dressed, stared at the ceiling for hours, and cried. Not from guilt. I cried because I realized there are things that cannot return to their place, because they were never meant to stay hidden. But once they come out, they belong to no one anymore. The next morning was like any other. The sun filtered through the curtains with that summer warmth that slows everything around. Mother kissed me on the forehead. The house woke as if nothing had changed, but I knew it had. I silently took a shower, dressed slower than usual. Every piece of clothing on my skin felt heavier. It was not shame, not fear. It was the realization that I had crossed a line from which there is no return. When I came down for breakfast, he was already there, drinking coffee, talking with my uncle, smiling as always. But when he saw me, for just a moment, his eyes told me that he remembered everything and that I did too. We did not exchange a single word that day, but every one of his steps through the house echoed differently. Every accidental touch in the hallway was now a memory that both hurt and shimmered. I left the next day under the pretext of urgent matters. Mother understood. Aunt and uncle regretted it. He helped me with my suitcase at the entrance of the house. When everyone was busy, he gently took my hand. "We won't talk about this, right?" "No," I said without looking at him, "but you'll remember it every day." The journey back was quiet, as if the train knew I carried something in my chest that I could not share with anyone. It was not remorse. It was a silent grief for everything that should not have happened and yet did. I did not regret it, but I did not celebrate it either. What we had was not love. It was the crossing of tired souls, a moment when desire pretended to be comfort, and comfort became necessity. Today, a month later, I still tell no one. Not because I am ashamed, but because there are stories not meant to be spoken aloud. They are meant to stay inside, where we keep what cannot be forgotten, though we learn to live with it. He is still my Uncle Sasha, but something died between us that night, and something else was born. Something more real, more sorrowful, and more grown. A new silence. A gaze no one has ever cast upon you before, and never will again. Sometimes the most unforgettable thing is not what we did, but what we allowed to happen by not stopping it. After returning to Kyiv, I tried to immerse myself in my usual routine, but everything felt distant, unreal. Meeting with friends, studying at the university, even walking along my beloved Andreevsky descent. Nothing could fill the emptiness that had formed inside me after those summer days in Cherkasy. The memories surfaced unexpectedly. His gaze, the accidental touch of a hand, the quiet voice asking seemingly simple questions, yet sounding so intimate. One evening, sitting in a cafe in Podil with a cup of latte, I caught myself absent-mindedly drawing his name on a napkin. Startled, I crumpled the paper and hid it in my pocket. It was becoming obsessive. I realized I needed to distract myself, to switch focus. My friend Alina suggested we go to a contemporary art exhibition at Mistetsky Arsenal. I agreed, hoping new impressions would help me unwind. That evening, I wore a light floral dress, my favorite beige flats, and took a small crossbody bag. I wanted to look casual, but also feel comfortable. The exhibition was crowded. We wandered between installations, looked at paintings, exchanged opinions. At some point, I got distracted by an unusual sculpture made of intertwined metal rods and lost sight of Alina. Looking around, I saw a familiar figure in another hall. It was him. My heart skipped a beat. What was he doing in Kiev? Impossible. Maybe I was mistaken. But no, it was definitely him. Uncle Sasha stood near one of the paintings, his head slightly tilted in thought. He was wearing a dark blue shirt and light trousers. He looked, as always, calm and confident. I froze on the spot, not knowing what to do. Approach, pretend not to notice, turn around and leave. While I wrestled with conflicting feelings, he raised his head, and our eyes met. There was no surprise in his gaze. Rather, a quiet acknowledgement. He slowly walked toward me. My palms were sweating. My breath quickened. "Hello," he said calmly as he came closer. "Hello," I whispered in response, feeling my cheeks flush. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said with a faint smile. "Me neither," I breathed out. An awkward pause followed. Around us the crowd buzzed, but for me there was only him. "How are you?" he asked softly. "Everything's fine," I answered, though it wasn't true. "Glad to hear it." We stood silently for a bit, looking at each other. In his eyes, I again saw that same something. Something without a name, yet it sent shivers down my skin. "Maybe we should have some coffee?" he suggested. I nodded, unable to say a word. We left the Arsenal and headed toward a cafe on Mazepa Street. We walked in silence, but this silence was no longer awkward. Rather, it was filled with a kind of shared, unspoken understanding. At the cafe table, sitting across from each other, we were finally able to talk. About what? About everything and nothing. About the exhibition, about Kyiv, about the weather. But behind every word, there was that same tension that had arisen between us in Cherkasy. I noticed how he glanced secretly at my hands, at the thin bracelets on my wrist. I felt hot. I pretended to adjust my hair, feeling his gaze on my neck. "You've really grown up," he said again, and there was a certain sadness in his voice. "Time passes," I replied. Our conversation was interrupted by a phone call. He apologized and answered. While he spoke, I observed him. How calm he remained, how confident his manner of speech was. Suddenly I caught myself realizing that I missed this, missed him. When he finished the call, he looked at me. "I have to go," he said with regret. "Yes," I replied, feeling a faint disappointment. He paid for the coffee. When we stepped out of the cafe, he stopped and looked into my eyes. "I hope we'll see each other again," he said softly. "I hope so," I replied, though deep down I knew this meeting hadn't been accidental. Several months passed after the Kiev encounter. I tried not to think about Uncle Sasha, focusing on studies and friends, but his sudden appearance in Kiev planted in me a kind of vague restlessness, as if an invisible thread stretched between us, reminding me of what had happened and what had remained unspoken. Unexpectedly, my best friend Veronica suggested we go to Minsk for the weekend. She needed to attend a linguistics conference, and I simply wanted a change of scenery. I agreed, thinking the new trip would finally scatter the memories of that summer. Minsk greeted us with cool autumn air and the gold of fallen leaves. We walked along wide avenues, admired the architecture, tasted draniki in cozy cafes. Veronica was absorbed in the conference, while I enjoyed the calm of an unfamiliar city. One evening, we decided to go to the opera and ballet theater. I wore my favorite black sheath dress that emphasized my figure, thin stockings, and shoes with small heels. I liked feeling elegant. During the intermission, we stepped into the foyer. There were many people, everyone chatting animatedly. Suddenly, I felt someone's gaze. Turning, I saw him again. Uncle Sasha stood by a column, speaking with someone. This time he wore a formal dark suit. He looked different, more official, yet his eyes still held that same spark. My heart started to beat faster again. What kind of strange coincidence was this? 3 cities, and in 2 of them, we met by chance. It could no longer be coincidence. He noticed me, and, excusing himself from his companion, walked toward me. Again. "Hello," he said with a slight smile. "Hello," I murmured, feeling goosebumps run down my back. "Minsk. What brings you here?" he asked. "I came with a friend for the weekend," I replied. "I see, and I'm here for work." We were silent for a while. Veronica approached me, looking at Uncle Sasha with surprise. I introduced them to each other. They exchanged a few formal phrases. The 3rd bell rang, calling the audience back into the hall. Veronica went to her seat. Uncle Sasha looked at me. "Will we see each other again?" he asked quietly. I didn't know what to answer. Part of me wanted to run, to hide. And the other felt an inexplicable pull. "Maybe," I replied evasively. After the performance, Veronica was thrilled with the ballet, but I thought only of that fleeting meeting in the foyer. The next day, as we were walking through the Trinity suburb, I suddenly felt a light touch on my hand. Turning, I saw Uncle Sasha. "Sorry," he said, as if he had accidentally brushed me in the crowd. But his eyes said otherwise. Later, as we stood by the Svislak River, washed in the colors of sunset, he appeared beside me again. This time he did not pretend it was an accident. "I wanted to talk," he said softly. We stepped a little aside from the strolling people. "What is happening?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. He looked at me with a long, piercing gaze. "You know what's happening," he replied. The air was thick with tension. I felt his nearness, his gaze sliding over my face. I suddenly wanted to touch him, to feel the warmth of his hand. "These chance encounters, they are not coincidence, are they?" I asked. He was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "No." "Then why?" "Because I can't stop thinking about you." His words sounded like a quiet whisper, but they echoed inside me. At the moment he took a step toward me, my phone rang. It was Veronica. She had lost sight of me. I answered, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Uncle Sasha stepped back. "I have to go," I said, looking at him. In his eyes, there was a strange mixture of longing and determination. "See you soon?" he asked. I didn't answer. I simply turned and walked toward my friend, feeling his gaze follow me. After Minsk, I returned to Kyiv in a kind of daze. Uncle Sasha's confession had caught me off guard. I didn't know what I felt or what I thought. It was frightening, exciting, and somehow magnetic. I tried to convince myself that this mistake was a fleeting illusion, but his look, his words kept echoing in my head. Unexpectedly, I was offered a trip to Almaty for a scientific conference. The change of scenery seemed like salvation. I agreed, hoping the distant journey would finally help me understand my feelings. Almaty greeted me with bright sun and majestic mountain views. The conference turned out to be interesting. I met new people, but in the evenings, when I was alone in my hotel room, my thoughts kept returning to Uncle Sasha again and again. On one of the last days of my stay in Almaty, I received a message from him. "I'm in Astana. How are you?" My heart started beating wildly. How did he know I was in Kazakhstan? And why was he in Astana? I didn't reply. I didn't know what to write. Several hours passed before I dared to send a short message. "Everything's fine." His reply came almost instantly. "I know it's not." After that message, I couldn't think of anything else. Inside me, conflicting emotions battled. Fear, curiosity, and that same inexplicable attraction. In the evening, I bought a ticket for the night train Almaty-Astana. I needed to see him. I needed to understand what was happening between us. In the compartment, it was dark and smelled of coal. Lights of stations flickered outside the window. I lay on the berth, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the upcoming meeting. What would I say to him? What would he say to me? The train arrived in Astana early in the morning. The city greeted me with a cold wind and a dawn sky. I stepped onto the platform, looked around. He was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, someone touched my shoulder. I turned. It was him. He looked tired, but in his eyes burned a determined fire. He was wearing the same dark blue shirt I had seen on him in Kyiv. We looked at each other silently. Around us, people hurried. Announcements echoed, but for us it was as if nothing else existed. Why did you come? He asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer. I simply reached out my hand to him. He intertwined his fingers with mine. His hand was warm and familiar. We left the station and walked through the morning streets of Astana. The city was just waking up. We walked in silence, holding hands. He led me to a small cafe. We sat by the window, ordered coffee, remained silent again. Finally, he broke the silence. I can't stop this, he said, looking straight into my eyes. Neither can I whispered in reply. He leaned in and gently touched my lips. It was a light, almost weightless kiss, but it held everything. Longing, tenderness, and a kind of inevitability. At that moment, a woman entered the cafe. She stopped when she saw us, her face twisted in pain and surprise. Sasha, she said softly. Uncle Sasha pulled away from me and turned to her. Lena. His voice sounded filled with horror. The woman looked at me, then at him again. Tears welled in her eyes. Who is she? She asked, her voice trembling. Uncle Sasha stayed silent, his gaze fixed on Lena. I felt as if an invisible hand had squeezed my heart. Who was this woman? What was between them? And what place did I have in all of it?